What would a Chinese classic look like if you translated it into Scots rather than English? In this episode, we're going to find out. I'm Angus Stewart, and you're listening to the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. So this episode is about The Mossflow, which is Brian Holton's translation of shuǐhǔ zhuàn, known in English as Water Margin, also known as Outlaws of the Marsh, also known as All Men Are Brothers, and also known by quite a few other English names. And it's also thought to have been written by quite a few different Chinese writers, the original version I mean, of course. There's various competing theories as to who wrote this text. So the two kind of front runners for the possible author, as it were, are hinner-en and luo guanzhong. The plain English version that I was using as a reference, which was translated by Sidney Shapiro for the Foreign Language Press, names is the word I'm looking for. That names luo guanzhong as the author. Some other likely candidates are Shuǐhǔ and guoshun. I'm just referring to the Wikipedia page for this. That could be a starting point if you're interested in this question of authorship. But for the sake of this podcast episode, I'm just going to focus on Brian Holton and his Scots translation, The Mossflow. Not going to look too much at the kind of mysteries of who wrote the original version. Before I do that, I'm just going to quickly do the plugs. So if you want to support the show and help me pay for the hosting fees, basically, for SoundCloud, there's two places you can do that. There's the Patreon, patreon.com/trchfic, TRCHFIC, and you can give a wee monthly contribution, and in return, there are wee bonus shows. I do like a 5 to 15 minute bonus show for each episode, and those are all up there for your listening pleasure if you want to be a Patreon contributor, subscriber, I forget the correct noun. And then for a little one-off contribution, there's Buy Me a Coffee. buymeacoffee.com/trchfic. All these links will be in the show notes, and there you can buy me a proverbial coffee. There's also the Twitter and the Instagram. So the show has an Instagram account. It's, as you might have guessed, trchfic. And on Twitter, I'm Angus Likes Words. I'm not trchfic on Twitter. And you can use both of those to kind of keep up with what I'm doing for the show and what other things related to all things Chinese and literary I'm kind of nosying around in. And you can also use them to chat with me if you wish. If there's anything you want to ask, or if there's anything you'd like me to say on the show, something I could address. If you want to correct me for some hideous mistake I've made, those are the places to do that. So I'd love to hear from you. So our next burning question is, who's our translator? Who's Brian Holton? And it's a question with interesting answers, because he's lived a pretty interesting life. He was born in Galashiels in Scotland in 1949, but he spent his first 6 years of his life in Lagos in Nigeria. And for his career, he's been in all sorts of different places, doing all sorts of different jobs. He started off in Scotland and the Scottish Borders in the BBC Radio Scotland, and in a museum. Then he had some different academic positions in Edinburgh, in Ningbo, back in Edinburgh again, in London, England, Newcastle, Hong Kong. And from what I can gather, he's settled in Hong Kong since about the millennium, and he's married to a Chinese lady, Guo Ying, who is herself an author. She writes travel books. But what he's mostly done as a translator is translated the Misty poet, Liang, into, as far as I'm aware, Scots and English. So he's got various publications of Chinese poetry and pieces into Scots, not into English. And he is the only, basically your world's only Chinese to Scots poet. And the big project he's been working on for a very long time, which is, if there is a finished version, the world of publishing hasn't seen it yet, is his translation of Water Margin. I think it was possibly originally titled Men of the Mossflow, and then it's since changed to The Mossflow. But yeah, so he's an interesting figure. He's certainly not your typical literary Chinese translator, and he is interesting in that he's strongly associated or paired with one Chinese author, Liang. His unique selling point, apart from that, I suppose, is the fact that he translates into Scots. So the next burning question, and maybe burning more fiercely for some than others, is what is Scots? Now, for some, It's a contentious question, and I'm certainly not a academic expert of Scots, and you can maybe hear from my voice, I haven't got the strongest Scottish accent, and when I'm kind of in conversation with my other Scottish pals, I don't use that many special Scots words, the words that exist in Scots English that don't exist in quote-unquote standard English. So if an American or other foreigner asks us people, the Scottish people, do you speak Scottish? We could interpret that two ways. We could take it to mean the quote-unquote indigenous language of Scotland, Scottish Gaelic, but that is it's not a dead language, but it's only really spoken by a small portion of the population in the Highlands, the Western Islands, and the West Coast. Speaking Scottish to most Scottish people would mean Scots, so Scotland's version of English, a dialect. I think there's lots of disagreement as to whether, well, at least online, there's a lot of disagreement about whether Scots is a language or a dialect or what. If I had to call it something, I'd call it a dialect. But yeah, Scotland's version of English. And it's something every Scottish person speaks to some extent, some more than others. It's something we cover at least a wee bit every year in English class. Like in primary school, you'll get some kids-friendly Scots poems. And then as you get older, you get given Robert Burns poems. He's our national poet, and he wrote in Scots. The Robert Burns variety of Scots is old. Modern Scots, if you want a good example of modern Scots written on the page, I can name two authors you should look for. Irvine Welsh, the guy who wrote Trainspotting, and then Chris McQueer, who writes funny wee stories using Scots for his characters when they're speaking in first person and for their dialogue. The Scots in the Mossflow is, I would say some of it is maybe the more oldie Robert Burnsy Scots with older vocabulary, and then there's other bits which really do read like modern Scots. The other tricky thing about Scots, well, there's a few tricky things, it's mostly a spoken language, so it can be a bit fiddly on the page because you can have like contradictory spellings, where or where not to put apostrophes if you're missing a letter. And also, like, Scots doesn't sound exactly the same in different parts of the country. So, like, my example would be, I'm from Dundee. For I, like, I did this, I did that. In Dundee, we'd see did this, did that. But I think in most of Scotland, it wouldn't be it would be I did this, I did that. You could probably pick out lots of other examples. You could probably pick out words that are used in some parts of Scotland in Scots that aren't used in others. The more you kind of get into it, I feel, the more fiddly it is to think about how one should write it, which I think makes this translation from Chinese all the more interesting. The choices Brian Holton's made to kind of synthesize from Chinese and synthesize his own way of writing Scots. There's my very inexpert take. If you are someone who disagrees, do so. Use Twitter or Instagram to send me your hate mail, please. So, burning question number 3. What's water margin about? What's the story? Well, I'll try and give you my elevator pitch. So this is one of China's 4 classics, and it's the only one, I believe, written in vernacular Chinese. You remember from the episodes I've done talking about new culture movement writers who were advocating a move in Chinese literature away from classical Chinese, kind of like Shakespearean Chinese, as it were, to something closer to spoken Chinese. So it's appropriate that Brian Holton's picked this one to translate into Scots, a very vernacular spoken form of English. It's about bandits, basically. It's about this band of outlaws who end up in conflict with the government, as it were, the imperial Chinese government of the time they're living in. It's set during the Song dynasty, I believe, and I believe it was written during the Ming dynasty. And the kind of band of outlaws grows and grows, and then eventually they kind of are defeated by the government, but the government allows them to band together to fight against the invaders. And the Mossflow, at least the version that's available, it doesn't make it, it doesn't go all the way up to this defeat at the hands of the government. So in the Mossflow, our bandits are just bandits. They haven't become kind of like patriotic resistance fighters yet. Since we're on the topic of the 4 classics, I'll just name the other 3. I'm sure a lot of you listeners know these 4, but if you don't, the so-called 4 great classics of Chinese literature are Water Margin, 3 Kingdoms, Journey to the West, and Dream of the Red Chamber, and their English name, they all have a few different English names. I think Three Kingdoms, you might also come across it being called Ballad of the Three Kingdoms, I think. Editor's note, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, not the ballad. Journey to the West, that's one popular translation of that is called Monkey. It's the one about the Monkey King and his pals going west. And Dream of the Red Chamber can also be called Story of the Stone, A Dream of Red Mansions. I think the Dream of the Red Chamber is easily the coolest name out of those. That's just my opinion. So where did I get this copy of the Mossflow, since it's not fully available to read? Well, it's up online for free on a website called the Scottish Corpus, which is basically a collection that's been put together of lots of different writings in Scots, and the Mossflow was included in this Scots Corpus. I'm just going to go to the Scots Corpus website and read a wee bit of its description of itself, just to help you guys understand what it is and what the Mossflow is doing up there. So this is from the homepage of the Scots Corpus, and it's kind of a description of itself, an introduction. I'm going to read through it swiftly. So quote starts here. Recent years have brought significant changes to the political situation in Scotland. Just giving you context here, this would be following the launching of Scotland's Parliament, so giving Scotland its own devolved, semi-independent government. This new political situation has been accompanied by a resurgence of interest in the languages and culture of Scotland. Advances in computer technology have made it possible to store and analyse large quantities of information in ways which were previously unthinkable. As a result, in recent years, much research in the humanities has focused on the building of large text archives and corpora. Such resources offer exciting opportunities to study language on a broad scale and with a precision which would otherwise be impossible. The Scottish Corpora project has created large electronic corpora of written and spoken texts for the languages of Scotland. The Scottish Corpus of Text and Speech, and that spells Scots, they're pointing out in brackets, has been online since November 2004, and after a number of updates and additions has reached a total of nearly 4.6 million words of text, with audio recordings to accompany many of the spoken texts. A sister resource, the Corpus of Modern Scottish Writing, was launched in 2010, and now comprises 5.4 million words of written text with accompanying images. Together, the Scottish Corpora allow those interested in Scotland's linguistic diversity and in Scottish culture and identity to investigate the languages of Scotland in new ways and to address the gap which presently exists in our knowledge of these. The resources also preserve information on these languages for future generations. So, there you go. My wee comment relating to the Mossflow is that the Mossflow is not in the corpus of modern Scottish writing, it's in the main corpus, and I think that makes sense because the language Brian Holton uses is not really modern Scots for the most part. It's a little bit more old school. We'll get into that a bit more. So just to give a wee bit more explanation, the organisations which were involved in this were the University of Edinburgh, the University of Glasgow, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So that would be UK state funding. And I unless I'm mistaken, a similar or the same government organisation helped to fund the publishing of A Perfect Crime, a.e.'s book in English. So just interesting to see where some of the non-commercial funding sources for this kind of stuff comes from. It's interesting and it's good that it exists. So how did I get onto this one? Why the Mossflow? Well, it was thanks to Twitter. I was observing a conversation that James Palmer, the senior editor of Foreign Policy, yes, the senior editor of Foreign Policy, was having about when certain Chinese words should remain in Chinese in English translations. And he was saying that sometimes there's value in choosing more obscure or archaic words if you're translating folklore. And he gave the Mossflow as an example because it goes to old kind of Scots words, and he thinks that's what makes it work so nicely, so beautifully, he says, even to English speakers. Although I would agree that the kind of folksy or archaic feel that the Mossflow has does work. The Scots works to that effect. Does it work beautifully for English speakers? So I don't necessarily have that perspective because I'm Scottish and I can read most Scots as it's written on the page, but I have a wee bit of doubt as to how accessible the Mossflow is to people with zero understanding of Scots. Just a suspicion, we'll get more into that later on in the show. So speaking of archaic Scots words, there's the title itself, Mossflow. What's a mossflow? It's not just something that Brian Holton made up. A mossflow means a wet peat bog, a quagmire, or a swamp. And it kind of plays into the swampy, marshy setting of the story of water margin. Some of the translated English names name the marshes as well as the mountains that the bandits are camped out on. So I'm just quickly going to go through all the different names that this story's had in translation to English, just to give you a feel for that. So we have, in no particular order, Water Margin, Outlaws of the Marsh, Tale of the Marshes, All Men Are Brothers, Men of the Marshes, and the Marshes of Mount Liang. One of the ones that stands out as being a bit different, All Men Are Brothers, that's an early translation by Pearl S. Buck, who also wrote The Good Earth. She's a very interesting lady, worth looking up. I think the Mossflow does stand out as well. It alludes to the marsh, doesn't use the word marsh, doesn't name the bandits or the men being brothers, alludes more to the landscape. I don't know if there's any kind of deep things to say about that, but yeah, there's your overview of all the different translations of the title. So there's been a lot of translations of this book. There's been a translation into Manchu, lots of different translations into Japanese. There was Pearl S. Buck's early translation, which was well received, but did have some kind of errors, some kind of mistaken or poor choices in translation. There's the Water Margin translation from 1937, and the one by Sidney Shapiro, the Foreign Languages Press one from 1980, Outlaws of the Marsh. That's generally considered to be the best standard English one. But yeah, there's your kind of full potted history of the translation of this text. I believe it's thought by some that should the Mossflow ever be published, it will in some ways surpass any standard English translation of Water Margin. That's a bit contentious because I don't think it's going to be nearly accessible to English speakers as standard English translations, but it's an interesting hot take. So to give you a feel for how my first impression of the text went, I'm going to read you the wee opener. Now, at the start of the story, it's kind of what you might call in a Hollywood film a cold open. It's separate from the main action, and it's with characters who, as far as I'm aware, don't appear again in the text. So this guy, Marshal Hong, he's sent on a mission. Well, Marshal Hong, I should say, in the Mossflow version. Marshal Hong is sent up a mountain to find a monk, and kind of fails on the mission. The monk already got the message before he arrived and passes him unknown on the way. And then Marshal Hong goes and accidentally unleashes 108 spirits, and in some way that leads to the forming of this band of 108 bandits. I shouldn't say spirits, they're demons. I forget exactly how they're named in the Mossflow. Maybe it's just demons. But yeah, I'll read you a wee bit of the opener in the Mossflow's Scots to let you get a feel for it. Right, so this isn't the very start. This is just a bit I know I can read without messing it up. Say it was at first for the Thrang step at the Councillor-in-Chief Zhou and the second Secretary Wen Yanbo wa proponit a fuarin the pest orins the capital and monis the leges at fortune, I don't know that word, fortune thereby. It's our hummel asking at the king's heinous first saw his loving mercy be the losin, don't know that word, the losin of felons, the lichting o' unlaws, and the diluting o' the cess, we mass and mate to begin again this ill dispensation, and the remeed say broch to the commenty. Yeah, I suck at this. But there's one excerpt. I'll find another one for you. Taking the royal orders, Marshal Hong gied his fair wheels to the son of heaven, and with a dictamen on his back and the royal incense in his horn, he back at his post horse, led his menu? Don't know what that is. His menu of Sinri score out of the eastern capital, and gied smartly to Worthyburn County o' Faithlands. They wan our Liang gied by to Faithlands town, where officers o' high and lake degree, I'm sure some I must know people who knows what lake would mean. Where officers o' hie and lake degree came out ayont the burr dykes to welcome them in. Men were often sent to let ken the abbey maester and the dragon priests o' Sublimity Abbey on Dragon Tiger Bray to guard them busk theirselves to get the dictum in. I've got to say, it's a lot more fun reading this aloud than reading it off the page. And there are some things I could comment on here. Oh, it's not Mareschal, it's Mareschal Hong. Interesting. So yeah, he's translating some of the proper nouns in an interesting way. So a lot of titles, like Marshal in the plain English, becomes Mareschal, and place names in a standard English translation, your place names would usually be rendered in just pinyin, the original Chinese word, or maybe they'd go for a very neutral, safe translation to English. But Brian Holton's kind of going all out here with names like Worthy Burn, Burn being a stream, Faithlands Toon. I'm not sure what the original Chinese is there. And things like streams, he calls them burr dykes and stuff. So in a way, it's a more creative, I suppose, translation, a bit more bold, but in a way it's capturing the kind of archaic, folksy feel of the original text. I'm quite curious, by the way, how much sense this is making to the non-Scottish listeners. If you've got anything interesting to say about the how much you can understand, or you want to tell me how crap my reading is, Twitter and Instagram, just get in touch. Okay, here's another wee bit about Mareschal Hong and his climb up the mountain. So he's about to meet a tiger. Then a flaff o' wind raised up out o' the corrie on the brae side, and when it was by, on a sudden fray in ahint the pine trees, wi' a girl like thunner, a muckle white-browed, gowden-haired beastie. Not beastie? Beastie? A gowden-haired beastie wi' boggling een came bringing out at him. Mareschal? I want to say Mareschal. Mareschal Hong fair gate a flag. He gied at the ae skreech. Don't know. He gied the ae skreech and cowpit o'er backer. The muckle beast cam on at him, run and run, wi' gurlin and wi' gowpin, till it turned and it skelpit off down back the banking and the banking and all. Down the back banking and all. There we go. Mareschal Hong was left streakit out at the tree foot that flayed his 36 teeth was dirling together, and his hair was playing dunty. Nice. And his hair was playing dunty, like dun, like 15 buckets on a wall. Seven o' them gone up and echt. Oh God. Seven o' them gone up and echt o' them got. Okay. Seven o' them gone up and echt o' them gone down. His hale body was numb, like he had the paralytics. Aye, the hawks he was like a warrit fechting cock, and his mow was aye Dulani. If I was better at reading this, it would be really good. If I was like 30% better, it would be awesome. So the only real comment I've got on that wee excerpt is you can feel there's a wee bit of humour there, the kind of onomatopoeic thing for the heart there, the dunty dunt. I'm not sure how much of that's in the original Chinese. I have read this section's original English. I don't remember there being a dunt of the heart, but yeah, it's quite amusing, this one, if you read it the right way. Okay, I'm going to read you another wee bit where Mareschal Hong is learning that the kind of wise monk he's been looking for is actually a kid. It's being explained to him. Our present papes know to be lichtlie, for he's a bairn, he's beyond our wice and skilly. He's a loon that's together by the common, a sheening luminance in ilka airt, and his prayers is effectful aboon either thing. Worldly folk cries him fundator via perfidor. Fundator via perfidor. So that title there, that is not Scots. That's Latin, or something that's kind of emulating Latin, and it seems that Brian Holton's done that for some. I wonder if it's terms in water margin which were in classical Chinese or more formal Chinese. So he's going for something that English and Scots draw on when they need some more classical terminology, Latin, or at least in this case something that looks like Latin, which I think works tonally, but God knows how I'm supposed to know what a fundator via perfidor is. Maybe understanding's not the point. I'm not quite sure. Probably a lot could be said here by someone who's more knowledgeable than me. but I've only got myself. So I'm going to go through some pros and cons of the Mossflow, pros and cons of using Scots and the way that Brian Holton's done it. And then after that, I'm going to do some kind of side-by-side readings. So I'm going to read Sydney Shapiro's English translation alongside Brian Holton's Scots translation. So, the pros. The Mossflow certainly does have quite a folksy or epic or archaic feel to it. There are reasons for that beyond just the tone of the words. I think humour, like in that wee bit where Mair Hong's fallen over and his teeth are rattling and his heart's beating, I think that works really well in the Scots that Brian Holton's using. There's like a cool otherworldly feel that I get from this book. I don't know if other readers would get it. Brian Holton's choice to change a lot of the place names to Scots places and the titles to kind of Scotsify them, or in some cases Latinify them, it kind of gives the setting or the context a partly Chinese feel, because the actual names of characters like Hong, Zhao, Li Jun, they all stay in Pinyin Chinese, but titles and places and proper nouns get Europeanized, I suppose. So you have this weird kind of mythical, unfixed in time and space setting. At least that's a feeling I get. I don't know if it's the same for other readers, but it makes this kind of semi-localization thing. And yeah, I think it's just an impressive intellectual feat what he's done with no one else to copy, just going out there on his own and embarking on this kind of crazy project, because Water Margin is a huge text, and he's going for a full, as far as I can tell, he's going for a full translation of the whole thing. So respect to Brian Holton for sure. Some of the cons, I think, are the things that stop me really enjoying reading this. I think the Scots occasionally feels a bit jarring, because it's, for me, the Scots I do feel comfortable with reading, as you maybe heard, I was stuttering there, would be modern Scots. And I feel like, especially reading this, just reading it in your head silently, you can't get full enjoyment of Scots. I feel like to be at its max potential, it needs to be spoken. That's why when we do Burns poetry in school, we often speak it. And when we do things like Tea Haggis or Tea Moose, it's best if someone's reading it full of gusto. I think I already mentioned that like some of the titles, the characters, when their titles are turned into funky looking Scots words or Latin words, I don't necessarily know like what they are. Like Marshall, okay, I can see he's a marshal, but Fundator via Verpador, I don't know what that would be. A dictamen, not really sure. Yeah, quite a lot of titles here that just kind of leave me blinking and feeling confused. Right, so now I'm going to do a wee side-by-side reading of just the very start of the text. I'm going to read Sydney Shapiro's English translation first, and then I'm going to read Brian Holton's Scots translation. So these have both come from the same source text, the Chinese, and we're going to see how they compare. So here's the start of chapter 1 in the Sydney Shapiro version. After the 5 dynasties' turmoil and strife, the clouds dispersed and revealed the sky. Refreshing rain brought old trees new life. Culture and learning once again were high. Ordinary folk in the lanes wore silk. Music drifted from mansions and towers. All under the heavens all was serene. Men dozed off at noon, midst gay birds and flowers. This 8-lined poem was written during the reign of Emperor Shenzong of the Song Dynasty by a scholar named Shao Yaofu, also known as Master Kangjie. From the end of the Tang and all through the 5 dynasties, times had been troubled. One short-lived dynasty had ruled after another. How true was the verse, Zhou, Li, Shi, Liu, Guo founded, Liang, Tang, Jin, Han, and Zhou. 15 emperors 50 years in a row, bringing hardship, tumult, and woe. So there's your Sydney Shapiro English. Now I'm going to read our Brian Holton Scots from the Mossflow. Ye the mixter master of the 5 dynasties Sturt and Stuar. Ae day the cinder clouds and smear let keek the lift. Nu 100-year-old Gress lies daggett wi new rain, and mensiful Lear retours to the valleys once again. Gauzy silk is scailt o'er honoured lawns and winds. pipe and therm in ilka haw, and charmer ring. The hale life world new tax the play in peace, and palace orchids we nae devol dover in the sun. A while, this eckline stave was scrivet by Zhou, was Halley name was Meester Puritas, a weill-kent scholar at the court o' King Shenzong, o the, oh my god, what word is this? Umqhile, o the umqhile Hous song. That must be imperial? Don't know. O the umqhile Hous song. He was vexed at the Five Dynasties, yon hinner-en o the Tang times, when there was naethin but weir and brulyie. In they days, whit was gins i the mornin, wad be Liang's by nicht. Oh, that's good. That's really good. Gins in the morning, Liang's by night. It was gins i the mornin, wad be Liang's by nicht. And richtlie was it said that Zhou, shall I keep doing the accent? No, I won't. Zhou li shi liu guo liang tang jin han zhou. 15 kings together. Skailt 50 year o stushie. So yeah, there's your two versions. As you can see, my mastery of the Scots is just not as up to par as how I can read the kind of more plain English. But there's maybe a bit more flavour in the Mossflow. You know, if you've got all the vocab and you're familiar with reading it smoothly, then you're in the gold seam right there. So I mentioned before that Brian Holton is also maybe the key English translator of the Chinese Misty poet Yang Liang, and I thought I would try and find one of Holton's translations into Scots of Yang Liang, because he's got a book called Weir the Deep Sea Devolves, which is a translations of Yang Liang's poems into Scots rather than English, because Brian Holton's done both. He's done Yang Liang's poems into English and into Scots. And I found a wee excerpt of writing for 8 other tongues by Mr. Brian Holton himself, where he kind of reflects on the kind of uses of Scots and English for translating Chinese, both in relation to Yang Liang and also to water margin shuǐhǔ zhuàn. So I'm just going to read that to you and then read the wee poetry excerpt that Holton includes after this. So here we go. Quote starts here. It's also true that I can hear one kind of text in Scots and another in English. Though I have made Scots versions of some of Yang Liang's poetry, as a youngish, internationally acclaimed modernist poet with serious leanings, he often speaks to me more in English, whereas the down-to-earth subversiveness of an outlaw novel brings out the border reaver in my blood. I'm going to put in a wee note here. So in the Scottish and English borders, there was quite a tradition, if you can call it, of raiding and strife and trouble. And as I said at the start of the show, Brian Holton himself is from the borders. So that's what that means by border reaver. Okay. Quote continues. And I can't help hearing Scots behind the Chinese when I read shuǐhǔ zhuàn nowadays. With Yang Liang, however, it seems to me that the essential hameliness, that means like homeliness, and he's put in brackets here, familiarity and intimacy, of the Scots, paradoxically enhances the strangeness at the heart of his poetry, just as the ordinariness of his poetic diction in Chinese contrasts with the oddness of his vision. What Scott seems to bring out is an earthiness, an immediacy and a strength, which, together with the spikier rhythms of Scots certainly is spiky, can transmit Yang's voice more powerfully than English versions have so far been able to. This is how he looks in Scots. So here's Weir the Deep Sea Devolves, and this has been put into Scots by Brian Holton. And he's laid out the lines quite interestingly. Some are left aligned, some are centre aligned, some are right aligned. Can't really get that across to you in the podcast, but it looks good on the page. Same as your weariness, blues eye hear yet. Same as a body's glower gars, his wallet the sea. His wallet the sea. Get twice as dreich, gone back same as I, to the rock stain lug where the drum beats a smooret. Peary coral corpse, a yowden drift, gary spreckles on deed fish. Same as the lift at Beald's your ilka want. Gone back to the meafs, same as the endless gone back, to the scores, storm heeds a about ye, your pipes weird it to skirl on after tunes of corruption, either your death. How o' the flesh, one blue's been kent at the last, the misanthert, oh God, the misanthert sea millions of condors, blithers and devolves. Oh, and then we have the same but in English. Where the sea stands still, just as your weariness, blue is always higher, just as a man's gaze compels, has chosen the seath sea to be twice as desolate, going back as ever, to that carved stone ear where drumbeats are destroyed, where tiny coral corpses fall in a snowstorm, gaudy speckles on dead fish, like the sky that holds all your lust, going back to the limit like limitlessness, going back to the cliffs, storm heads all around, your pipes doomed to go on tunes of corruption playing after your death, deep in the flesh. As blue is recognised at last, the wounded sea, a million candles, stands dazzlingly still. So yeah, there is something lost once you just have it in plain English, like storm heads all about ye, versus storm heads all around. The Scots, I think, is better there. But for me, the gothic-y darkness stands out a bit more in the English, even if it is plainer. Also, I read the English more smoothly, so it has that going. I really don't know how other Scottish people my age with better handling of Scots would read this. I think there's a lot of words here that are maybe of Brian Holton's time and not of my time, and that's the thing with Scots, because it's spoken and it's vernacular, it evolves, and I would say more so nowadays it gets more complicated because we have more transmission of slang through the internet, so different parts of the UK can speak to each other online using their own little lingos, and I can't think of any concrete examples, but I definitely think words from kind of informal slang from England have incorporated themselves into modern Scots. I have absolutely no evidence to back that up, but I just think it's a thing I've noticed, that modern Scots is interconnected with other informal ways of speaking in English, including American English, that it wasn't in the past. And Brian Holton's, he's not of that time, and he lives in Hong Kong these days, so the Scots he's using in these translations is oldie worldy, I would say. So yep, that's all of my amazing deep takes for this episode. Just another interesting thing I found, again, just on the Wikipedia page, there have been kind of like proto-fan fictions of water margin, shuǐhǔ, zhuàn, written in Chinese a very long time ago. There's a kind of like an unofficial sequel, shuǐhǔ zhuàn, which means the later story of the water margin. There's Jinping Mei, which is an erotic novel which features characters from water margin written by different authors. And there's a really interesting, I can't think of the right word for this, a revisionist version, that's the word, by a Mr. Dang Kou-zhi. Oh no, sorry, that's the name of the text, Dang Kou-zhi, written by Mr. Yu Wan-chun, and its title means The Tale of Eliminating Bandits, where basically Yu Wan-chun thought, no, these are criminals, they suck. So he wrote a version where they were bad guys, ruthless mass murderers and destroyers, says Wikipedia, and they all eventually get taken out by the government and I guess killed. Interesting stuff. So yeah, just a little fun factoid about water margin for you guys. All available for further reading if you just go to Wikipedia and then click the citations, as you should do if you want to be better at citing your sources than me, just constantly referencing Wikipedia. Let's go on to our word of the day. So I thought I would give the name of the 4 great classic novels, because there is actually there's a few different terms for this in Chinese, but I think the most common one is 四大名著, which means the 4 great masterpieces. 四大名著. A wee handy phrase I learned too late, honestly, in my time living in China, is Ming, I think literal translation might be something like have fame or have name, but basically Ming means famous. So we could say, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but we could say that shuǐhǔ zhuàn Ming, water margin, is famous or has fame. There's your word of the day. So for the bonus show that I'm going to put on the Patreon, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch a little YouTube video of Liang and Brian Holton commemorating, I think, another member of the Holton family who was a writer, and just talk about that, give my impressions. And I'm also going to watch the first episode of a 2011 TV adaptation of Water Margin. Its English name is All Men Are Brothers, the Pearl Buck title. Because the reason I've chosen this 2011 version, because as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of different TV versions. I was just putting in Google best TV adaptation of Water Margin, and it came up with this article from the Global Times, which, if you haven't heard of the Global Times, it's an English language nationalist state Chinese paper and website. So they take positions which are not strictly the Chinese government, like the China Daily Line. They're often more hawkish and more aggressive. So they're an interesting publication, and they have an article about this 2011 adaptation, which they denounce as being inaccurate and gay. And I was like, hell yeah, inaccuracy and gayness in a classic. Sounds interesting. So I'm going to watch that and then share my thoughts on that. So that's all for this episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. The episode that's next, so in about maybe 3 weeks' time after my holidays, is going to be on Zhang Zilong's Empires of Dust. We may well have a cool guest on that episode. Cool guests only, of course. In the interim between now and then, do give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter. Remember the Instagram, it's Trushafik. Twitter, it's Angus Likes Words. You can give me feedback on this episode. Tell me how bad my Scots readings were. I would like to hear that. Don't forget you can support the show through Patreon and buy me a coffee, but also by subscribing if you're not yet subscribed on whichever podcast provider that you like to use. And most importantly, by telling your friends. Tell your friends about the show, tell your brothers in arms, tell your sisters in arms, tell your dog, tell anyone who'll listen, really. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe out there, watch out for tigers, and 再见.